Our next speaker is Daniil Zavlunov, who is Associate Professor of Music History Theory at Stetson University in Florida. He is a musicologist who, as his bio indicates, works in several areas, primarily 19th century Russian music. He's also interested in censorship, which is part of his current book project, which explores opera in the 19th century within the Russian context, within the imperial theater's context. He's also somebody who is an expert on Glinka in particularly. From his PhD, he's published in several journals, including Journal of Musicology, Cambridge Opera Journal, and Music Theory Online and elsewhere. And I believe that this project is something, correct me if I'm wrong, that is emerging from your current book project on opera in Russia during the time of Tsar Nikolai I. So please welcome Professor Zavlunov.
Thank you, Simon. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, wonderfully.
Excellent. Thank you. So I've spent the last 2 decades, as Simon just indicated, researching and writing about opera in Russia during the 1830s and 1840s, first with my study of Glinka's operas and more recently with my exploration of opera in the context of Russia's cultural policy. During these decades, opera in Russia's capital underwent an extraordinary transformation, evolving from a culturally and politically marginal institution to the dominant and most profitable form of theater. It is only in the 1830s that opera became a viable public genre, a form of mass entertainment accessible to many and accepted by most. And that happened because of the government's cultivation of it. In part, the transformation resulted from the legislative reforms affecting various institutions implemented immediately before 1830, the theater statutes of 1825 and 29, and the censorship statutes of 26 and 1828, codified the daily operations of the imperial theater system. The transformation was also a consequence of Nikolai I's personal involvement in crafting Russia's cultural policy, which positioned opera at its center. In St. Petersburg alone, manifestations of this opera surge included the importation of 2 Italian opera companies, strengthening of the German opera troupe, development of local operatic talent, and then subsequent creation of the Russian Opera Company, total overhaul of the repertoire, professionalization of the musical establishment, construction of new theaters, support for the Russian composers, and much else besides. And yet, despite a small mountain of scholarship, some of it of exceptionally high quality, we have barely begun to tell a comprehensive story of opera in Russia during these years. What we have are histories of Russian musical nationalism, histories of Russian musical works, the Russian operatic canon, which for these years amounts to exactly 3 operas, histories of a few Russian composers, and histories of a few key players, a Kapellmeister here, a singer there, perhaps a music director, and a few instrumentalists in the mix. What we still need for this period, in my view anyway, are studies of opera that include the larger context of social, cultural, intellectual, political, and institutional history. There are important small-scale studies that tap into these historical modes and which have begun to tease out the role of the individuals who have made day-to-day decisions about opera, which consider foreign opera troupes in Russia and Russia's participation in the transnational operatic networks, that examine the institution of censorship, and so forth. I'm thinking, of course, about the works of Anna Just, Yelena Petroshanskaya, Galina Petrova, Svetlana Lashchenko, Rutger Helmers. I could go on. But still, we're writing small fragments of a story, of a history, I should say. Large-scale studies that might give us a panoramic view of the rich operatic culture in these decades are still fully lacking. Even in producing these exciting fragments, those of us working on this period are continuing to try to situate our work in relation to grand historical narratives of musical nationalism, of the birth of Russian opera, Glinka. Which means that we, even as we chip away at it, are still accepting the overall shape of the traditional story. I would suggest that we blow up the whole story and rid ourselves of the ingrained historiographic lenses, including the persistence of the origin myth, which centers the whole story on Russian opera, and the so-called great man model, with its emphasis on great composers, great music critics, and great singers. In constructing a fuller history of opera in Russia during this period, we need to demote Russian opera to reflect the historical reality and importance of other national traditions. After all, the history of opera in Russia in these decades is decidedly not a history of Russian opera. The number of original Russian language operas for these 2 decades could be counted on 10 fingers, with the significant ones on a single hand. By contrast, in St. Petersburg alone, well over 100 unique Italian operas were performed during the same period, with about half as many of the French. Our more holistic history would also address the history of institutions, which provided the infrastructure that supported the creation, production, and dissemination of opera, and also the history of state policy, which enabled and defined the very existence and function of these institutions. Further, both institutions and state policies are inextricably linked with the individuals who pulled the levers of power. Within the autocratic system, the most powerful historical agent is the monarch himself. But situating Nikolai at the center of the narrative of opera runs the risk of collapsing the entire system with all of its intricate mechanisms and individual players into that one person, and that's dangerous. Instead, I would argue that the story of opera becomes more interesting in nuance if we embrace what I call the operators of the system: state ministers, theater administrators, dramatic censors, semi-official music critics, and numerous others in the hierarchical chain of Russia's cultural production. Minute decisions and actions of these individuals functioning within specific institutional frameworks affected the course of history of opera in Russia in the 1830s and 1840s as much as did composers and singers. I intend now to illustrate the way that studying institutional structures and practices, state policy, and the influence of individuals can illuminate the inner workings of the imperial opera system. I will present 3 episodes in the history of opera in St. Petersburg, largely by relying on official state documents preserved in the Russian State Historical Archive. I hope that these episodes might suggest ways for us to tell a more textured history of opera in the future. Since being appointed by Nikolai as the director of the Imperial Theaters in 1829, Prince Sergei Gagarin had competently and steadily piloted the system through some very rough waters. By 1832, the Italian opera troupe that operated in St. Petersburg for 3 years was dissolved with minimal political fallout. The theater budget was stabilized for the first time in history. The reforms of the theater school implemented in 1829 were beginning to bear fruit by producing Russian singers of exceptional abilities. The new Alexandrinsky Theater was built and was now fully operational. Things were looking up. Throughout his tenure, Gagarin showed remarkable independence of mind. The dissolution of the Italian opera troupe in the spring of 1831 left a musical void in St. Petersburg, and many members of the city's highest aristocracy sought to pressure the state to reverse the decision and reestablish the company. Pairing up with various Italian impresarios, several members of the nobility attempted to partner with the government to bring back Italian opera, sending numerous proposals for such partnerships to the Minister of the Imperial Court, Prince Volkonsky. In most cases, the impresarios, with their aristocratic sponsors, promised to provide the soloists, while the state was expected to furnish everything else, including a substantial financial subsidy. That each proposal was acknowledged, reviewed, and returned with a detailed response suggests that the state gave careful consideration to these projects. Moreover, when forwarding these proposals to Prince Gagarin for review and reply, Volkonsky would make it clear that Nikolai himself supported the idea of reconvening the Italian opera troupe. Prince Gagarin would have none of it. Having already witnessed the unpopularity of one Italian opera troupe and having dealt with its financial fallout, Gagarin knew the problems of the initiatives. And so when the proposals for new such troupe began to pour in, he took a decisive stance against the very idea of Italian opera troupe in the city. He did not see how the presence of the Italian troupe would be financially viable. And more importantly, he was concerned that its presence would interfere with an ongoing state project of strengthening the German opera troupe and creating the Russian one. His rebuffs to the proposals, always carefully reasoned and worded, detailed his concerns. Reviewing one proposal in July of 1832, Gagarin wrote that, having thoroughly examined this project and all of its conditions, I found in it only obvious in all respects losses for the treasury. Gagarin first highlighted the fact that the 150,000 ruble state subsidy would come from the Tsar's personal accounts. He then cataloged the demands which would have to be covered from the budget of the theater's directorate. Apartments and heat for the soloists, separate orchestra used for the Italian opera troupe, decorations and costuming, the choirs for the Italian performances, which would have to be outsourced, the lighting for rehearsals and performances, disruption of the regular repertoire, complications to the rehearsal schedule of all troupes, loss of the Bolshoi theater twice a week to the Italian opera, and last but not least, loss of regular audiences on the days when the Italians would perform. In short, Gagarin concluded, from this establishment here of an Italian troupe by the entrepreneurs, the directorate will suffer total disintegration in its finances. Gagarin's justification for rejecting the reestablishment of Italian opera proved convincing. And Volkonsky, despite his knowledge of Nikolai's wishes to the contrary, actually sided with Gagarin. In the end, Nikolai had to concur, and after 1832, there would be no attempts to establish another Italian company for 10 years. As a result, the resources, both financial and musical, that might have been consumed by the Italian troupe were directed towards the Russian and German opera companies during this decade. By concentrating the resources in these two troupes, the directorate would be able to significantly improve the orchestras and vocal personnel so needed to perform the latest operatic hits, both foreign and domestic. And this in turn would mean that the Russian and German opera troupe between them could cultivate 4 different operatic traditions: French, German, Russian, and Italian, and to do so without the competition with the Italian troupe. Was Gagarin some sort of visionary? I very much doubt it. Rather, he understood the economics of the theater business, and he actively pursued other components of the broader cultural policy, which envisioned a new place for German and Russian troops. Gagarin himself, however, was not destined rather to realize these components. Throughout 1832, he repeatedly clashed with his boss, the minister of the imperial court, on matters of cultural policy. And since to stand up to Volkonsky meant to stand up to Nikolai himself, Nikolai replaced Gagarin with Alexander Gideonov in May of 1833. Gideonov came to Nikolai's attention through the auspices of the minister of the imperial court, Volkonsky, during the horrible cholera outbreak in Moscow in the early 1830s, when Gideonov proved himself to be one of the most effective administrators. And in fact, he was a professional bureaucrat. Gideonov's new job as the director of the imperial theaters did not differ much from that of his predecessor. 3 basic things were expected of him: prevent budget deficits, expand and diversify the theater offerings, and elevate the theaters in St. Petersburg to the level of the best stages in Europe, which for opera meant Paris. To succeed in these tasks, from the outset, Gideonov made his bet on the drastic changes to the operatic repertoire. Gideonov, who it would seem kept his finger on the pulse of Europe's cultural trends, mounted a full-on lobbying effort to have the finest hits coming from Paris heard in St. Petersburg, going for their novelty, currency, and spectacular stagings. Gideonov's bet on opera was strange enough. Until now, opera did not attract large audiences. His bet on French grand opera was outright dangerous, for Nikolai abhorred the genre's politics and categorically prohibited any previous attempts to stage these operas in St. Petersburg. But Gideonov was relentless in pursuing his goal, and he worked the system. Gideonov already had the ear of Volkonsky, who picked him for the job. He also befriended Leonty Dubelt, the chief of staff to the director of the third section, this is the secret police, who had the ear of his boss, Alexander Benkendorf. Working together, these individuals tried to convince Nikolai to allow the staging of French operas, and they succeeded. Nikolai agreed, provided that the librettos were thoroughly sanitized in the process of being translated and adapted for the Russian stage, with Nikolai himself taking the lead in pre-approving the modified plots. The person charged with making most adaptations and translations into Russian or German would be Raphael Zotov, the director of the repertoire of the theaters and a trusted monarchist. The chief censor of the third section, one August Oldekop, would then ensure that anything remotely dangerous in the new libretto would be scrubbed from the final text and would thus recommend the opera for staging, despite his personal reservations. At the end of his career, Oldekop would reminisce. For a period of 12 years, I was the theater censor, and during this period, my single and constant duty was the reading of the outrageous works of the newest romantics. That which at the beginning was disgusting to me over the course of many years became for me less unpleasant, in a place most vile without any moral purpose were still approved for and performed on our stage. And indeed, in his censorial reports, he consistently supported the acceptance of these brutalized works for staging, arguing that in the end, the only thing that really mattered was the music itself. Finally, the semi-official periodical press, in the guise of Fadei Bulgarin, was entrusted with explaining to the public why the French librettos required such modifications for staging in Russia. In a way, an entire new system was created for French opera, and an entire network of historical agents responsible for the process was engaged. Gideonov's bet paid off big. The first triumph of his tenure was the production of 1830s as Fenella, sung in German in January of 1834. No money was spared for the spectacular staging. The stage set itself was imported from Berlin. The opera was a total success, receiving over 100 performances in just 2 years. Having seen the sensation that was this production of Fenella, Gideonov immediately sought to replicate it. While the German troupe continued to sing Fenella to sold-out houses, the newly created Russian opera troupe mounted Erol Tsampa in June of 1834, which it followed with Meyerbeer's Robert le Diable in December. Writing the annual report on the operations of the imperial theaters following his first complete year on the job, Gideonov noted that, and this is a quote, "The ticket sales, despite the brevity of the carnival, surpassed all expectations, exceeding 1 million rubles. The directorate, by the means of strengthening of the repertoire alone, made such huge takings." Indeed, the annual ticket sales exceeded by more than twice what the law mandated, and much of that excess came from opera. Greater still was the prestige. In the same report to the emperor, Gideonov wrote about Robert le Diable. Despite all the challenges, both musical and seeing, it premiered 14th December to the astonishment of all audiences, with such brilliant success that all foreigners who had seen the opera in the best European theaters admit that not only has St. Petersburg opera become their equal, but that it actually surpassed them in many respects. Thereafter, with one exception, every major operatic work coming from France would be heard in St. Petersburg in some form, usually within 1 to 2 years of its Parisian premiere. With French operas selling out, Gedeonov shifted his attention to Italian repertoire. In the theater year 1835, Bellini's Norma and Rossini's Semiramide took St. Petersburg by storm. Although the theater year was significantly shorter, the takings were some 50,000 rubles greater than the previous record year. In his report to Nikolai, Gedeonov stated, "Such huge and surpassing all expectations receipts should be attributed to the excellent quality of the operas, which the directorate mounted with much expense and labor, but which earned our stages European fame." To be sure, Gedeonov was clearly trumpeting his own successes, but he also had a point to make. By way of the repertorial transformations, the theater's directorate was attracting more and more people to opera, raking in huge profits and raising the European status of St. Petersburg's operatic culture. In 1836, opera broke all box office records. Bellini's I Capuletti e Montecchi was so popular that it had to be given by both Russian and German troops at the same time. The other big opera of the season turned out to be the one that Gedeonov did not want to stage. It was Жизнь за царя, an opera newly composed by some amateur, Mr. Glinka, Gedeonov wrote to Nikolai. Note, however, that Gedeonov's antipathy to Russian opera did not prevent him from jumping on the bandwagon of its spectacular success, or for that matter, taking all the credit for it in his report. In his report for the theater year 1836, Gedeonov looked back at his tenure as the director. Over the past 4 years, the welfare of the Imperial St. Petersburg theaters has continued to increase noticeably, with the yearly improvements to the shows also increased the number of those attending the theater. And this at such a fast pace that the receipts, already growing annually, nearly doubled in the theater year 1836 when compared to the most abundant of all other years since the founding of the St. Petersburg theaters. The table on the screen shows the annual total ticket sales for a 5-year period. The annual operation cost for all theaters in St. Petersburg was about 900,000 rubles. Anything above that amount was pure profit. But the Imperial Theater system was a not-for-profit institution, which meant that any surplus that the directorate acquired immediately was reinvested in the system itself. What did that mean for opera? Well, it meant that the directorate could mount new operatic productions with increasingly more lavish stagings. It meant that the directorate could hire better singers, many of these in Europe. Usually this meant the acquisition of singers for the German troupe, and indeed some of the finest vocalists in Europe at the time were hired out, if you like, by the Imperial Theater's directorate by 1838. The operas in which these great soloists were singing, Fenella, Robert le Diable, La Juive, they also required first-rate instrumentalists, and these had to be paid premium. Over the 1830s, all of the principal players were newly hired for all orchestras. These instrumentalists had European renown. Surpluses contributed to the restructuring of the musical establishment within the theater system, so new permanent groups of musicians were created. For example, in 1836, the directorate formed a choir of brass players consisting of 10 people. This was the only means to provide the orchestra with the possibility of performing with precision the most challenging passages which appear in the music for the brass with the valves. Until this was implemented, the orchestra had to rely on musicians contracted from the military bands, who could not always cope with the latest operatic repertoire. In addition, the surpluses were used to purchase new physical spaces. In 1836, Gedeonov purchased a new building for the theater school, much larger, in every respect more superior, and conveniently located just behind the Alexandrinsky Theater, where it still is. He justified his decision to Nikolai by arguing that since the theater school produces the entire personnel for the Russian dramatic and operatic troops, and also largely for the ballet, the students should be provided with the best facilities possible. And finally, surpluses also allowed for the theater renovations on a grand scale. Thus, the surplus of 1835 season was used to pay for the expansion of the Bolshoi Kamenny Theater in 1836. During the 7 months, the beautiful, more spacious and comfortable theater replaced the old one, Gideonov reported. With several hundred extra seats added and more splendid decor than any other theater in Europe, the Bolshoi reopened its doors in November of 1836 with the premiere of Glinka's Жизнь царя, as you all know. Gideonov continued in his report, the receipts from the performances at the Bolshoi after its rebuilding prove that the success of the renovations corresponded with my expectations. This renovation, by the way, allowed the directorate to dedicate the Bolshoi Theater to opera and ballet exclusively. From the perspective of European observers, by the early 1840s, St. Petersburg was a capital whose operatic culture could rival that of any European center in terms of its currency and vitality of the repertoire and the size and preferences of the audiences. In terms of pay and fringe benefits to foreign musicians, St. Petersburg far surpassed any other city in Europe. It is in this context, for instance, that the creation of the famous Italian opera troupe in 1843 with its superstar French and Italian singers must be understood. The operatic culture during the 1830s and 40s warrants a holistic treatment, one that would permit us to reimagine the story of opera in Russia. In supplying you with only a few historical episodes, I tried to at least hint at the larger panorama of opera in St. Petersburg by way of employing different modes of historical inquiry, highlighting institutional frameworks and mechanisms that made opera possible, foregrounding the operators who worked individually and as collectively to realize the state's cultural policy, incorporating fragments of that policy in my story, all the while not privileging Russian opera over others. In advocating for holistic history, I'm cognizant, of course, of the enormity of the task. Nor am I naive enough to think that any one person can actually write such a history, even just for these 2 decades. It has to be a collective endeavor. Perhaps the time is now for those of us who work on this period to get together and set the record straight by producing a new history of opera in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniil. Marvelous, provocative, and we already have a couple of questions. So first question from Anna, just anybody? Oh, sorry, I'm just looking at hand claps there. Any questions?
Yes, but if I may,
Go ahead, sorry.
Just a small one, because yes, I totally agree with with the project of a collaborative effort to write a new, a wider panorama of the musical life in Russia, actually, because when we call it Russian music, it's already oriented, and it becomes difficult to change the categories of the discourse. Yes, just one little question regarding what you said at the beginning of your paper. If I correctly understood, because I always have some feel it so fast, although you were expressing yourself very clearly, but just wondering, because I had the impression that there was a period when, before the management of Gideonov, when the authorities actually were in troubles in receiving Italian opera as a company. I mean, because of these financial troubles that also troubled the institutional life also since the 18th century, actually. I this is it's just a little case, but the case with Giuditta Pasta, who actually came at the beginning with the company of 1843. I had the impression that it became several years before. We already talked about this when I showed you the documents I have about this person, this figure of Giovanni Battista Perucchini. And my impression was, if considering only that case, so this is not the complete frame, but I have the impression that since noblemen aristocrats tried to foster the cause of Italian opera in St. Petersburg, the process of creating became so long. And actually what Nicholas I actually realized in 43 was prepared since several years before. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think the success of the 1843 troupe greatly depended on the failures of the previous 15 years. Okay, I think that would be the way to answer your question, is that the government, and it had to be the government that paid for it, just because by law, private sponsorship of opera was illegal in Russia during Nicholas's reign. And so when you had all of these attempts to, well, first they established the opera troupe in 1828, right, and operated for 3 years, and then that collapsed. And then you have the private sponsorship working with various entrepreneurs or impresarios, right? All of this is kind of an effort to try to figure out the best way to run it. So I think you're absolutely correct in that the government and the private sponsors, they learned through failures, right? And on top, of course, of all of this, you have these great vocalists visiting Russia every year for the Lenten season concerts, right? So they're performing in Russia throughout this period. It's what you do not have is a state subsidized troupe that operates.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think in part, the reason you don't have it during that decade, while they're trying to figure out what's the best way to run it without going bankrupt,
yes.
Is the fact that Gagarin really put his foot down in this 1832 moment and said, hey, listen, we've tried this before. It really didn't work. Let's hold our horses.
Thank you. If I may, I'm trying to find the funding for a project about the reception of Italian opera in Russia. It is very hard to find fundings in Italy at this moment, but this ideally it will be a collaborative project, because I think the majority of testimonies about Italian opera usually regard the performance of soloists, of vocalists, and more rarely research has been carried out about the reception of Italian opera as a genre, the problem of the libretto and how libretto damaged the evolution, the development of Russian opera, and etc., etc. So I hope we will see each other on this subject in the future.
That's an exciting project, and I agree. I think it's important.
We will be in touch.
Any other questions? Okay, go ahead. I don't know whose hand that was.
Keenan, I think it was your hand.
Hi, thank you. I just want to thank you for this fascinating bit of history, and congratulate you on such a massive undertaking. I mean, I'm sure I'm speaking on everyone's behalf, and as Simon already did, and just pointing out that this, these are the kinds of details that I find so fascinating that I wish we could just take for granted whenever we open a book on this subject, but which are so hard to gather logistically. So I just want to say thank you for doing all the work to put that together for such a critical period. And I wonder, since you opened this Pandora's box of not taking anything for granted about the history of opera in Russia, could you please help me to understand how your presentation should inform our broader understanding of opera in Russia? Because we know that a troupe was in St. Petersburg, an Italian troupe from, it was the 1730s, right? It was 1730s that Italian opera was
1730.
there.
Yeah.
And there was the local cultivation of operatic talent and obviously the importation. But what I'm curious about in particular is, well, I was really glad that you pointed out that European observers also lauded the Russian operatic enterprise, because it's so easy for the cultural outposts to succumb to provincialism in their own estimations of their achievements, right? And so when you pointed to evidence that this was received in Europe, well, also it made me wonder, well, how did that change over time, both before and after? I mean, during what period of time in your work are you seeing that we should regard St. Petersburg as being a cosmopolitan leader in the presentation of opera? Was this period fundamentally different than the long period in which Italian opera was presented, in the 18th century? Does this make sense? I'm just looking for some overarching kinds of, how do I inform this in my understanding?
And so one of the reasons I focused specifically on these decades was because things around these decades are different. Okay. If we rewind 20 years, St. Petersburg is a major cosmopolitan center. If we go into late 40s and especially the 50s, it's a major cosmopolitan center, right? But history works in cycles. And there are moments in St. Petersburg's history where where opera and operatic experience is kind of down. Okay, the audiences are not that interested. The genre is not particularly well received. Where in these international networks between musicians of various countries, they disintegrate, and then they have to reconstitute themselves. And one of the things that happens, looking just a little bit before the period I'm interested in, so going to about 1815 on, and Anna will probably be unhappy with me saying that, is that during this latter half of Alexander's reign, there is a bit of disintegration of opera in Russia. And into the first years of the Nikolai's reign, you have this big problem of trying to recreate that culture, right? So what in some ways you could say is Nikolai's trying to give opera the prestige it had during the reign of Catherine. Okay, whether he's doing that deliberately or not, I can't tell, because he doesn't talk about his grandmother, but he really wants to create a massive operatic culture in St. Petersburg. Okay, the culture that kind of withered after the French invasions, let's say, right? So kind of around 1815 on. And so again, we go through these cycles, and I'm specifically saying that 1830s is so important because this is when the cycle is on the uptick. Okay, things are really looking up. So that would be my answer. I hope it answers the question.
No, that's great. So you're not rewriting everything. You're just addressing a problematic period.
There are far more qualified people to talk about the kind of the periods on the outer frame of the years I'm talking about.
Well, thank you all the same. Really interesting.
I still think, though, and I'll comment here, is that I think the idea of more holistic as an integrative history is essential. And I do think that we need to be looking at institutions and politics and people and, cultures kind of holistically rather than in individual pieces. I think that's one of our problems. And that does apply, I think, to a larger picture.
Anything else?
If I may.
Anna, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I do agree actually with what Daniil said, because it's not coincidence that I have been working on Caterino Cavos for my previous research, and it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that he was the Kapellmeister of the Russian opera troupe, not of the Italian. He was by contract Kapellmeister of the Italian troupe, but there was no Italian troupe really. There were no singers. Some individuals who remained from previous companies, but these were not the established good company that had been existing during the previous decades, actually. And there are ups and downs of Italian opera, and looking at the reception of Italian opera during this long period that you were mentioning, actually gives us a picture of the reception of the state of opera actually in the feelings of the Russian court and the elite of the society that was surrounding the court. And Galina Petrova this morning was speaking about some individuals that actually she was saying that are sort of footnotes in the institutional history of music in St. Petersburg, but they worked actually and were in professionals of the same level of the previous Kapellmeisters, but the environment they were included in was actually not so organized as before, and as it would be in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may just ask, I have three small questions, which may be big ones for you, Daniil. The first one is just a sort of small one about box office. Do we know how much actually it costs to go to the opera? So that's one question.
It costs from 50 kopecks to 20 rubles per ticket usually.
Okay. And
it also varied by the troupe.
we have a sense of what 50 kopecks was in 1835. How much that was?
If you earned 1,000 rubles a year, you could live off comfortably.
Okay. All right. Good to know. All right. Sorry, that's a small one. Second question has to do with whether or not in this kind of expansion of the history of Russian opera, you are taking into account serf theaters and serf composers, because it seems to me that there were some of the serf theaters, Sheremetyev, et cetera, did do sort of small operatic performances. And this issue about the imperial theaters and then private opera, and then there's this other domain where obviously composers like this fellow, right, who was a serf composer, oratorio composer, only attained his freedom at the end. But so that is the second question, and then the third one has to do with figures like that and the works they produced. At what point is it important within this study to actually say that the Romanov dynasty, their historians, became obviously fascinated with the smuta? There is no end of operas to deal with the events of 1598 to 1613. And at what point in the history of the 19th century did opera, primarily in the hands, I suppose, of Russian composers, begin to actually focus on the smuta as a form of entertainment, or also as a form of, for the Romanovs, a means to actually demonstrate their superiority to what took place in the past? So the serf question, and then the issue about historiography and the Romanovs vis-a-vis the smuta, I guess those two questions I'm interested in. Forgive me.
Right. Neither one is particularly easy. The serf theater question, I think, is interesting in that you always had this parallel aristocratic musical culture running along with the official one. Okay, and I've focused on the big official theaters. Right, there's always a production, especially in the provinces, in the serf theaters, of operatic works that has come out of the 18th century, and it continues alongside this huge explosion of official kind of opera sponsorship in the 1830s, probably until about 1840. I have not looked at this question deeply. The imperial theaters until 1835 or so depended actually on serf theaters, okay? And it did so by way of hiring musicians, both instrumentalists and vocalists for the choruses in opera from serf ensembles. Okay, so from private serf orchestras and serf singers, these were hired out for a year, sometimes for multiple years, as was the case during the Italian opera project in 1828, where half of the orchestra for the Italian opera #1 came from a serf orchestra. Okay, so that's the relationship. What's different, I think, is this distinction I'm making of opera as a public form of mass entertainment and opera as private aristocratic experience, right? Serve theaters fall into this private mode of very wealthy elites. And I'm trying to kind of refocus the discussion of opera on this mass spectacle that's accessible to the masses, however you define the masses during this period. Okay, so in terms of the smuta question, there's actually a huge number of plays in the 1830s, okay, by Zotov, by Kukelnik, several Moscow writers that deal specifically with this topic. There is no conversion, however, to the operatic stage. That's one of the things that doesn't happen. And Nikolai is very explicit about this idea, right? Opera was always more dangerous, and I've argued this before, because it packs a punch through the emotional content of music, okay? And so when it comes to politics, any representation of mass disobedience on the stage was categorically prohibited in the world of opera and accepted in spoken theater. So there is this disconnect, I would argue. So in the 1830s, smuta is widely represented on the stages in spoken drama, but never in opera. So when does it change? I would have to say that it doesn't really happen until you get into Alexander's reign.
The Reform period, or you think it's
the Reform period? Yes. So after 1862.
So it's interesting that you're saying that, I guess, the idea of disorder or unrest represented on the theatrical stage without music somehow was less provocative, I suppose, right? That's what you're implying.
Yes, that was, I think that's at least that's the way I've understood the difference. Yes. Because
the problem that arises with, you're saying, well, there's all of these plays that come out about the smuta in the 1830s is, you know, that's suggesting that there are these kind of theatrical adaptations of history, right? But of course, the history itself is theatrical, so that, you know, all of these, half of the sources related to Russian history or some degree, you know, sort of fiction on different levels. So it's that line between reality and fiction, I think, is very fluid. And so I think probably that's part of the reason why.
Well, somehow the music, the song music, makes the reality real.
Yeah, it's like, it's well, yeah, the passions. But thank you. It's a marvelous project, and it's much overdue. And I really, you know, you have tremendous energy, and you're going to need it. But you know, it's a massive project. But with the Vipitino henceforth becoming the world center for actually the rethinking of the history of opera, I think you'll have a lot of company for that. So, Kruzhok. Thank you very much. And that ends this session. And if you are, I guess,